It is common historical knowledge that there have been two world wars. World War I, fought in the 1910s, which changed the course of world history, just like the second one, in which the German Empire collapsed and the remnants of it were eventually taken up by the Nazi government, who, along with Japan and Italy, perpetuated World War II. These wars were extremely bloody, costing the lives of millions of people, huge devastation and destruction to infrastructure and the environment, and altered the course of world history as empires rose and fell, countries rose and fell, and the influence of the United States and other empires like Britain and France changed because of them. But what if I told you that there have been more than two world wars? That the First World War was actually in the 18th century, and it is not an exclusively 20th century feature to have the continent of Europe explode against itself, with a bunch of different colonies being implicated in that process, with huge amounts of resources expended, huge amount of human suffering involved, and the course of world history changed forever as the results of the world map look entirely different from what was before. This is the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763. It began once again because of German aggression. In this case, the Prussian aggression because the Germans hadn't been unified yet under Frederick the Great. But just like the German aggression of the 20th century, Prussia's aggression to be a great world power and to gain more and more land in Central and Eastern Europe brought about huge issues that would involve many of the same partners. Once again, empires like Britain and France relied on their colonial satellites to help them. Once again, Austria was involved, this time as a foe to Germany instead of its biggest ally. And once again, the march of the German war machine was one of the biggest issues in the entire war. The calamitous 7 Years' War began in North America in 1754, when the British began fighting French and their Indian allies all throughout Canada and the 13 colonies, as well as the western territories that constitute the American Midwest. In Europe, the Russians were involved in this one, just like with the other two world wars, as were the British with their powerful navy and the French with their great army. The expansionism, chauvinism, and nationalism of these countries would yield calamitous results, much as they did with the great powers of the 20th century. And just like then, the world would never be the same. In the 1740s, Frederick the Great, the greatest military man of his era, had opposed the rise of Maria Theresa as the Archduchess of the Austrians. As an attempt to also increase Prussian hegemony and dominance over the German peoples, the Brandenburg Prussians under Frederick had attacked Maria. The War of Austrian Succession had involved many of the great powers of Europe and had eventually led to a stalemate. Maria would not have long to rest, as Frederick soon seized Silesia, and 8 years after the end of the Austrian War of Succession, fighting broke out on the continent again, with Russia under Empress Elizabeth coming to the aid of the Austrians, while King George II of Britain, a landholder in Hanover, came to the support of the Prussians. Meanwhile, the French joined the conflict on the side of the Russians and the Austrians, as they were already fighting the British in North America, the 7 Years' War being really a 9 Years' War, with the French-Indian War starting in 1754, where the British, their Indian allies, and their American colonials fought the French in their overwhelming support from local natives. This was to control Canada and the American Midwest, and would be one of the major features of the war. At the same time, 2 years later, the fighting broke out on the continent, with Prussia being surrounded by the French, Russians, and Austrians. The British and the French would be involved with fighting on the continent, with generals like Cumberland proving himself extraordinarily successful in his fighting against the French. The war seemed to be going well for the British, who used their naval dominance as well as their huge control of the American colonies to gain them more and more leverage. This was also the case in India, where the fighting between the British and French had broken out through the years as both sought to increase their power and influence. The Indian Empire, the Mughal, were in great collapse, and rival Rajas sought to vacuum up as much of power as was left over. This had led to several different confederations like the Maharatha and other organizations seeking to control as much power as possible, but the British East India Company was on the rise and sought to gain more and more influence over the Rajas, more and more land, more and more wealth, and more spices for the British mercantile trade. Robert Clive, better known as Clive of India, won many great victories for the company, defeating both the French and their large forces of Indian allies. The British army proved to be far more successful, winning huge victories at Plassey, later followed by taking the settlements of Chhatnagar, and of course Pondicherry, the French capital in India. Many of these victories were not just against French forces, but against large forces of different Rajas, breaking the spirit of the Indians and ensuring more and more control by the British, who seized Bengal by the end of the war and broke the spirit of French control in India. Meanwhile, Frederick the Great continued to show the world that he was the greatest commander, the greatest army in all the earth. He won huge battles such as at Lobositz against the Austrians, Zorndorf against the Russians, and Rossbach against the French and their allies. However, they came at crippling cost, and after the victory at Prague was particularly costly for the Prussian forces, the tide began to turn for the Austrians, who won and struck back at the Battle of Kolin. Meanwhile, the Russians had arrived on the field and began their surrounding process. Led by the great general Pyotr Soltykov, who worked well in the service of Empress Elizabeth, the Russians won a huge battle at Kursendorf, and Frederick was forced to retreat. His victories were limited and very costly, and his defeats were equally as costly for his own side. It seemed as though he was going to be overrun. Surrounded and encumbered by his enemies in 1761, the war seemed all but lost. But then fate intervened. As the Russians celebrated their victories in Christmas early in 1762, Elizabeth Petrovna, the Tsarina and daughter of Peter the Great, died, leaving the throne to her nephew, Peter III. He was a Prussophile and a longtime devotee of Frederick and his tactics. He pulled Russia out of the war, which allowed the Prussians to turn the tide on the Austrians and the very struggling the French. This was a difficult war for the French and their king, Louis XV, as the fighting opened up on a fourth front, with Africa being involved in Senegal and Ghana. The French once again lost more and more encounters to the British. The British had been successful in India as well as in Africa and Europe against the French, and a major reason for this was the might of the British Navy, which was the best in the world. The tiny island had come to rely on their great navy to be able to compensate for their lack of manpower and resources compared to the French or the Prussians or the Russians. And it was this very same fleet, while successful in India and Africa, that soon sailed up the St. Lawrence River in Canada, conquering Montreal and Toronto, leading to huge and humiliating defeats for the French as the war turned against the French and they lost more and more control over their Canadian territories, especially Quebec. The French soon found themselves at a loss, and the war in North America was wrapping up, as their Native American allies could not overturn the British, their colonials, and the Iroquois, their closest Indian allies. By 1761, the war had come to an end in North America. The French-Indian War, a subtext of the 7 Years' War, but equally important. At the same time, Frederick the Great had turned the tide, and it had seemingly been a miracle that the Prussians and British had been able to overturn the great conflicts and encumberments that surrounded them from the natives in India and North America, as well as the Austrians, Prussians, and French, for the Prussians, and able to win a huge war. Meanwhile, a new continent came into play as the Spanish joined the war, hoping to turn the tide in favor of the French and curb the power of the British as they sought to preserve their wealth and power in Central and South America. They attacked Portugal, leading to the Fantastic War, in which Portugal won many naval battles in South America with the help of their longtime British allies. The Spanish were defeated, the French were humiliated, and the British ended up getting what they wanted at the Treaty of Paris in February of 1763, as the 7 Years' War and French-Indian War seemed to be coming to an end. The British gained control of Canada and the American Midwest, while France lost all of its territory in North America and was horribly humiliated. 5 days later, at the Treaty of Hasbrouck, the 7 Years' War ended in a stalemate, with Frederick having survived long enough to be able to prevail, basically winning the moral victory. Maria Theresa would remain on the throne, but Prussia would continue to grow its influence, while at the same time the French, having suffered horribly through the war, would be coming to collapse. Bankruptcies here and in their involvement in the American Revolution would soon lead to the overthrowing of their king and the French Revolution, while at the same time Prussian dominance would continue to grow throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, with Frederick seizing more and more land throughout his long reign, and eventually Germany becoming powerful enough to form the German Empire of the Kaisers that would start, or at least help to start, the next World War. The British would continue to gain more and more influence and control over India, making it more and more of a colony until the entire subcontinent was under their sway and dominance by the 19th century. The Native Americans were promised the Midwest as their own preserve, a land that they could stay in and not be worried about. This would change after the American Revolution, as the British now became the predominant power not just in Europe, but in North America as well. But victory did not come without a cost. Heavy taxation of their colonies, especially without representation, would lead to the American Revolution, and a young officer from the French-Indian War named George Washington defeating the British forces at Yorktown in 1781 and helping the Americans gain their independence. So the war was responsible for both the French and American revolutions. At the same time, Peter III of Russia would not have long to celebrate the victory of his hero, Frederick the Great. He was soon hated by the Russian people for having given in on the war, and his wife Catherine overthrew him and had him murdered, and soon became the Russian Empress, perhaps the most famous female ruler in human history, Catherine the Great. So Russia was changed significantly by the war as well. This war was indeed a war of change, much like the other two world wars. It saw the decline of the French monarchy, the rise of the British Empire, the subjugation of Native Americans, Africans, and Indians, and the continual growth of European imperialism that would come to dominate the 19th and 20th centuries and set the stage for the other two world conflicts. At the same time, the French monarchy declined, leading to the French Revolution. The British taxed their colonies, which led to the American Revolution, and Spain's empire continued to crumble over a long period of stagnation and decline, while the Russian Empire would flourish under Catherine the Great. Such changes, implications, heavy uses of technology, the loss of life, and global fighting can only be best surmised as occurring during a world war. I hope you enjoyed learning about the 7 Years' War and its history. It's always fascinating to me that it doesn't get the attention or recognition it does, and so much changed because of it. If you enjoyed this, consider liking and subscribing, leaving a comment for feedback or suggestions about the channel. I upload every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you on TGIF. And yeah, consider liking and subscribing, and that's how you become a friendly neighborhood historian. I also have a Substack where I write articles and a Patreon where I upload more exclusive content. Check out my short series, such as my one on Russian history that's happening right now. And I have social medias as well. I hope you have a great week. Take care. I'll see you next time. And remember, love history.